Hey there, everybody, and welcome to our second live blind tasting. Hopefully, I'm going to have some folks. I see a few folks joining in. Sorry, I was a few minutes late, but this our new life here at the Exchange. Things are always pretty hectic and crazy, but I think it'll probably quiet down now that there's a huge storm upon us, which is a good time to be inside and tasting wine, which is always fun. And I'm going to just give everybody a few minutes. I see a few people saying hi. I'm going to give everybody a few minutes to get on. And I know about how many people signed up, so I can kind of check in and see. And also, if y'all can let me know how it seems, making sure we aren't having any buffering issues again this time. It was weird too, it's great that the buffering issues we had last time, when you go back and watch the video, the recorded video, there's no issue. So that's nice. But I hate that. I mean, that's the one downside to doing all this online programming. Oh yes. And happy birthday, Kelly. I heard it was your birthday too. I see. I love that you're spending your birthday blind tasting wine. All right, I'm going to go. I actually realized I don't have my tasting sheet, which is not very professional of me. I'm going to grab my tasting sheet and also just see if there's any other folks that are joining in. And also be sure to let me know if it seems like everything's pretty clear this time. Okay, I'm back, y'all. And also, hopefully the sound, y'all can hear me pretty well. It is raining really hard here, which it's always nice in the shop. It's a nice sound, the rain is. But yeah, I wanted to grab my tasting sheet, which is this little sheet that I put in. It should have been in all of y'all's bags. Hopefully everyone has this sheet handy, and hopefully everyone has their wines like I had emailed you about in wine number 1 in glass number 1, which I like to have on the left, and wine number 2 in glass number 2, which I like to have on the right. There are some folks that did this last week, but there are also some newcomers. So I do want to have a little review. And I mean, I'm sure, I think most of y'all, even that are doing it again, and that y'all don't come like every week to our blind tasting. So I think everyone will probably appreciate a little review. And then you're going to really have this down pat. I also just wanted to, before I forget, first things first, say a big thank you to all of y'all for being so supportive, of this tasting, of all of our programming. We really appreciate it. And, I know that this is it's wearing everyone down, especially, as things go on. I mean, I do think we're at least halfway through it, and looking forward to the other side when we can just have you here in the shop. I mean, there's some of y'all that might not have been in the shop before. And I think probably a good bit of y'all have at least not been in for our usual blind tastings. We usually have blind tastings every Wednesday. And, it's really fun. It's a drop-in event. This is going to take about an hour. But the blind tastings on Wednesday, they don't even necessarily take that long. So a lot of people come every week and they just sit down and go through the wines on their own. And we usually, we usually in our old world have a full menu so you can have snacks while you're blind tasting. And so, but y'all are going to be pros after doing these classes to come in and do it on a Wednesday. And I really look forward to that time again. Although this has been a great adventure, it will be really nice just to have folks back in the shop where we can talk to you in person instead of emailing and talking on the phone. But once again, just thank you. We cannot thank you enough. Colin and I really appreciate the support, and it's keeping us going. And yeah, just can't thank you enough. So without further ado, though, let's jump into our blind tasting, or really, as I like to correct myself, really we're talking about being a blind evaluation. And I gave y'all all this handy sheet. On the back of mine, I have the the scary version of it, which is known as the blind tasting grid. And I know that you can't, it's probably a mirror image, you probably can't read it, but this is the organization that Colin and I both have gone through testing, wine testing for the Court of Master Sommeliers. That is their blind tasting grid, which it looks intimidating, but it's actually very logical. There's some other blind tasting, blind evaluation techniques that they work well, but I really love this grid. And our easy to read sheet that you have is based on that grid. And it is a blind evaluation because we say blind tasting. It's easy just to say blind tasting, but it really is about evaluation. And that is using not just our sense of taste, but also we're going to be talking about sight. And then we are going to be talking about smell. And then we're going to talk about taste. And, you may wonder, why do this? Is this like just some silly parlor trick? And I always like to say that, no, it's not. It's a great way to really learn. I mean, the point of it from, a professional standpoint is really understanding what does Pinot Noir from France and its homeland taste like? And especially compared to what it tastes like in, say, Oregon or California. And this is a way you really can learn a ton. And on that note, these are going to be classic shop, but the point today is classic varieties from classic regions. And the point for, even if you're, I think it's fun to kind of get this technique down, but also the point for you as a consumer and just enjoying wine is to better understand what you like and dislike and be better able to describe that when you come into a shop or when you are in a restaurant. It can be really intimidating. There's tons of bottles on the shelf. You can see here behind me, or you go to a restaurant that has a big, thick wine list. The great thing is there's tons of wine professionals, great wine professionals in this town that love talking about wine. And so just with like a little bit of vocabulary to say what you like and dislike can really help. So let's jump in to our two wines tonight. I think this will be, especially those of y'all that did it last week, it's going to be a fun little contrast to last week. So the first thing we're talking about is sight, if you're looking at your sheet. And for sight, like I said last week, I like to take my wines and hold them at a 45-degree angle over a sheet of white paper, like the sheet that I gave you, the Wine Tasting 101 sheet, and take a look and see the color difference between these two wines. And we're going to be looking at the actual color, like we would describe a color as being purple or orange. Or we're also going to be looking at the concentration of color. So talking about the color in these two wines, I love it when it makes it a lot easier and more fun for me if you have some responses. So does anybody want to chime in, type in a response about what they see as the color difference between these two wines? I will wait for you, and then I can always say it. And as maybe you're taking note of this, I will say the concentration of color is going to be referring to just how easily could you read through these wines, which both of these are pretty easy to read through, which means they're not a dark concentration of color. Color is, I always say, it's the nerdiest part of this technique and class, if you will, because, odds are you're not going to come into a wine shop or restaurant and say, oh, I love a really deeply concentrated red wine. But you can actually tell a lot from the color. So it's an easy way to impress your friends and family with some knowledge. Okay, good. I have at least one person chiming in. Misty, I know I can count on you. Wine 2 has more of a reddish brown color. Very good. And when we're talking, I'm going to get to that, what Misty said in a second, but when we're talking about the concentration of the color, that how easily you can read through it, that is showing us how thick or thin the grape skins might be. So color in a wine comes, and I see it's more comments. I'll get to those in just a second. But color in a wine, it comes from the grape skins. If you cut open a red grape out in, in a vineyard, it would just be like a table grape, one we get at the grocery store. When you cut it open, it's going to be white on the inside. So it's really the skin contact that gives it color. Thicker skin grapes, not surprisingly, those are going to give more color. Thinner skin grapes have a lighter color. So this is theoretical knowledge. You kind of just have to get down your thin and thicker skin grapes. But really, you only need to know a few. So most famous thin skin grape of all would be Pinot Noir. Another not very famous thin skin grape would be Gamay. And so those would be a lighter concentration of color. There are a few others. There's some famous Italian grapes that actually lose their color really fast. We talked about that last week with our Sangiovese. But thicker skin grapes, giving you a really deep concentration of color, which neither of these have. We'll be talking about where you can't even read through. The really famous thick skin grapes would be what we call the Bordeaux family of grapes. Bordeaux is a place in France, a famous wine region, and the red grapes from that region are going to be Cabernet Sauvignon, Cabernet Franc, Merlot. Those are all going to be thicker skin grapes and will have a concentration of color where you could really hardly read through. And I'm sure anyone that loves, any Napa Cab lovers out there, I'm sure that if you are, you know that like how deep that color is in the glass, that deep concentration. So here with both of these, we're seeing they're really, you can read through both of these pretty easily. So we're not, right away, we're like, okay, these are probably not like super thick skin grapes. That's what I'm saying. You actually learn a lot just by the sight. So number one, we're saying has, more of a purple color. I see Kelly saying that. And then, Misty had said number two has more of a reddish brown color. And that is very telling. With this purple color like this, for one thing, it's showing that this is probably a wine on the more youthful side. So think about if we had an apple and cut it up and left it out on the counter, what happens to it? It turns brown. So brown in wine also is going to be showing you there could be some oxygen at play. And oxygen with wine is showing some age at play, whether that's age in a barrel at the winery or age in the bottle. Or it could be a little bit of both. So that little bit of orangish brown on number two showing, there might be some age on this. And number one, just that very purple color, it's a very youthful color, I will say. I'm going to take a little sip of my water. I hope you have some water handy because that is helpful. The other thing I did want to mention, especially, everybody that was here last week already heard this, but it's something that I always find comes up a good bit. And it's on your sheet, it says tears. Tears, you might hear, you'd be used to referring to them as legs. I always like to just swirl the wine around like this to get where you can really see the tears or legs. And it's just how the wine is going to be streaming down your glass. And that can show, in a perfect environment, it can show you be a hint towards the alcohol content of the wine. Because imagine if we had a port in the glass. I'm sure everyone's had a port at least once. Port is a famous fortified wine, and it really has a thick consistency, like a syrupy light consistency. And it would be very slow moving down the side of the glass. I just rolled number one around, and you can see how it's not that scientific, with these wines, like saying how quickly the tears are moving down. I mean, they're pretty quickly. Even the Court of Master Sommeliers, the organization I mentioned earlier that Colin and I have gone through testing with, even they have moved away from this idea of the viscosity because a lot of things affect it, like if you are washing your glasses in a home dishwasher, it'll leave a film that messes with the tiers. Also, the temperature of the wine affects it. But just so you know, I mean, that is why people bring that up. So with these, I'm not noticing a huge difference in the tiers, like how quickly or slowly they're running down the glass. Now we're going to move into the really fun stuff, which is going to be smelling and then tasting. And this is supposed to be fun for y'all. I mean, we teach a lot of classes here, so I always have a hard time not just going into full-on teacher mode. Y'all are at home. I mean, this is like your happy hour. I want you to be having fun. So if you're wanting this, I can't see you. You can sneak a little taste of the wine. But the way that we like to do is move through, really spend some time with smell before we taste. Smell is, I think the most intimidating part of this because most people think that they have a really don't have a great sense of smell. I mean, they think that there's some, that people in the wine business and probably perfume and coffee business as well have some like superpower, but that's just not the case. I mean, unless you have some major sinus issues, I think we all have about the same sense of smell. We're just not as used to using our sense of smell as we were thousands of years ago when it could have saved us from eating something, that would kill us. Nowadays, we just don't use it unless you're in the wine business, coffee business, perfume business. But I encourage you, work on your sense of smell. I mean, I was in the cooking side of things before I got into the wine side of things, and I would just smell, and I continue to do that when I cook at home. Everything, all the ingredients. I mean, this time of the year is the perfect time to be smelling all the spring flowers. So it's really fun and just getting in touch with that sense of smell. They say 80% of taste is smell. And it is true. I lost my sense of smell once for 2 weeks, and it was terrifying. I mean, you only get texture on the tongue, really, when you really lose your sense of smell. So we are I recommend taking a small sniff without swirling of each wine, like number 1, small sniff, and then number 2, small sniff. And that's just our first. It's like we're introducing ourselves to the wines. We're just getting that first impression. On our list here, right underneath where it says smell, the first thing there it says is flaws. Now, those of y'all that got the email earlier that were the recipients of my email, I told you to actually open up the wines, a few hours in advance, let them breathe for one thing, but also in case you had a flawed bottle, you could run down here and I could get you a replacement. So the most common flaw in wine is referred to as cork taint. It is a chemical compound that occurs in the cork. There's nothing wrong with the actual wine. It wasn't the winemaker's fault. And if you are a really fancy, very wealthy winery, you can afford to buy corks that are analyzed, and you would never have cork taint. But the reality is, that's very expensive. Most small producers cannot do that. So invariably, you'll end up with some that have this, musty smell to them. And that is why you're given that little bit in the restaurant. They'll pour you the little bit to check on it, make sure it's okay. And if you ever get a corked bottle of wine, you can definitely bring it back to a shop. I don't know about a grocery store, but yeah, that's, shop, restaurant. We end up sending it back to the distributor it goes all the way up the supply chain to the winery. So, yeah, of course, I smelled both of these earlier, and hopefully y'all did too, and did not get any cork taint. There are also other flaws, but I would say, while here during normal times we get at least a few bottles a month that are corked, other flaws, we run into maybe a few times a year. So not worth worrying about just from a consumer point of view. So now we're going to delve in a little bit further, and we can give them a little swirl. And so I said earlier to not, swirl, and you could lose some really delicate aromas with swirling. Also, I guarantee that with a swirl, it's going to open it up a lot more. And now that we are introducing ourselves to the wines a little bit more, I want you to start thinking about fruit and about earth, and thinking about this pendulum swinging between fruit and earth. This is like what I always like, the very basics of getting into smelling and tasting. And I bring up that fruit versus earth because stereotypically, and it is a stereotype and there are exceptions to the rule, we would find that old world wines, meaning all wines from Europe, are going to be more on the earthy side, and New World wines more on the fruity side. This is due to largely to climatic conditions. There certainly are some New World winemakers who are striving so much to emulate their Old World heroes. They're coming close, but usually there's still just a little bit more fruit on New World wines. So wine number one. Anybody want to give me some descriptors? You'll see I have it broken down into fruit, non-fruit, and earth. And I think, that can help you, because I know it can be difficult at first to come up with descriptors. With fruit, with a red wine, I usually think about, is it red fruit? Is it black fruit? One or the other, And then from there, you can get more specific. Is it strawberry? Is it raspberry? Or if it's black fruit, it's like, is it blackberry or blueberries, like kind of in that black fruit quality too. And we can also think about, some orchard fruit. I've got Kelly saying fruit strawberry on number one. Yeah, I would agree. Misty, red fruit on number one. What about some non-fruit on number one? Are we getting any flowers? I mentioned flowers earlier, which I think it can be easy to think of flowers more with white wines. But definitely red wines can have some floral component, especially some like roses. Natalie saying red fruits. Agree that strawberry comes through the strongest for me. Yeah, I'd say strawberry, some cherry to me as well. But yeah, any flowers or herbs, and this is where it comes in handy, like I was saying, to start smelling all your ingredients as you're cooking. Spices. And then when we talk, and I'll let y'all think about that, and the next thing is going to be earth. And when we think about earth, we'll think about organic earth, which is like actual dirt, potting soil, forest floor, versus inorganic earth, which is more of this like crushed rock, whetstone thing that comes out. Anybody getting, anything, any non-fruit or any earth on this? I will say what I think. Definitely more, Brianna is saying definitely more fruity. Thank you, Brianna. It does come across as fruity. There is something dark in the background to me in a nice way. I mean, I just planted my garden this past weekend, and it has a little bit of that potting soil or, that fresh garden soil quality. But definitely there's that fruit. I mean, and I will say the fruit for me is almost like a candied fruit. Misty's like a little bit of non-earth, a little mushroom or non-fruit, a little mushroom. The next thing, Jessica Baldwin, bit of soil in there. Yeah. And I think that, just noting it on the nose, and we'll get to confirm it on the palate. And that's why this is, kind of a three-step process, because sometimes the nose can trick you into thinking one way, and then we get to tasting it, it's a different way. So the last thing under smell would be oak, and I have, French versus American, or new versus old. So when I say oak, I'm referring to a oak barrel and the decision a winemaker has whether to age in oak. I'd say majority of reds probably see some oak versus a lot of whites don't. I mean, you can just have them in stainless steel tank the whole time. There's also other options for vessels. But oak, it can have just an oxidative effect, as we talked about earlier, talking about color, if it's older. Or if it's a newer oak, it can have a major flavor component. The thing is that oak, I mentioned this at the end of last class, is it's expensive. New French oak barrels are they're like $1,000 a piece. And if you've been to a winery, which I'm sure a lot of y'all have, being wine lovers, you know how many barrels are there. So if you start smelling a lot of oak on a wine, which oak would come through as, to me, French oaks, there really are the two different types, French versus American, the major types we see being used. To me, honestly, French, it has a more sophisticated, not so much in your face smell. It's more like how really nice leather smells. Here at the shop, when we do our blind tasting class, I have some oak chips. You can buy oak chips from brewer supplies and brewer supply, websites, and soak them in water, and then you really get to know what oak smells like. That's the best way, I swear. But American oak, the other type of oak, so American oak, that's what's used for bourbon, whiskey, and it, we all know what that smells and tastes like. It's a lot more in your face. A lot more of this like kind of intense vanilla. They both have some vanilla. Vanillin is a compound in the oak, but it's just, American's a more intense version. And, French, I'd say, is the most commonly used oak, but there are certain parts of the world where we see American oak being used. I mean, certainly there's some here in America, but there's actually a really long tradition of American oak being used in Spain, specifically in Rioja. It's a long tradition there, and there is a certain way that it interacts, because they usually use aged barrels, or not new, and the way that it interacts with the wines in Rioja, it leads to this very specific smell and taste. We'll also see American oak being used in Australia as well. So just wanted to have my little talk about oak as we move on to wine number 2, which, if we remember, it had this orangish brown color, showing it might have some age on it, or that at least spent some time in oak. That's why I wanted to have us think a little bit about it. And getting back to my point about the expensive oak is, if you're going to smell a lot of new French oak on a wine, you have to think, this is an expensive wine. Like, somebody spent some money on this wine. So the only caveat to that is the fact there's a lot of inexpensive Chardonnay that seems to have a lot of oak on it. Well, you can just throw oak chips in the fermentation tank, but that's why that also doesn't taste very good. I mean, oak, when used correctly, is a really nice tool and flavor, but oak chips are not so much. But let's move on to wine number 2. Did you notice wine number 2, to me, I haven't even swirled it, and it seems to jump out of the glass a little bit more. Does anybody else have that feeling? And that's what it would be on your sheet. It says intensity. I mean, I'd say both of these they're like, I'd say wine number 1 is about medium intensity of aroma, but wine number 2 is jumping out of the glass. Misty, right out of the gate, is saying coconut, and which might seem, if you haven't done this before, or smelled a wine like this, might seem kind of crazy, but I mean, it's pretty dead on the money. So let's give it a swirl. Wine number 2. Okay, I have, Weston agrees with coconut. I just think it smells good. Yeah, it has a seductive smell to it, I would say. It has a little bit of what I was, that leather, that very nice leather smell too, that I associate with oak. So as you say, right out of the gate, does it seem, I know we're not even really talking about fruit or earth. Would you say, does it seem to have the pendulum swinging towards fruit or earth on this one? Fruit versus earth. And I didn't even take a picture of this last time, so I'm gonna take a picture real quick while I let y'all decide if it seems like it's more fruit or more earth. I do get the coconut fruit. Misty's saying fruit. Natalie, I'm getting some notes of bread. Kelly's earth. Yeah, I think it's tricky on the nose of this one. It's like it's tricky deciding whether it's more fruit or more earth on it on the nose. Question, can the smell be fruity but the taste be earthy? Yes. That's what I was talking about, how it can be kind of tricky. And that's kind of a classic old world quality where it can actually smell fruity. And then we're going to get to the palate and all of this fruity smell that you're expecting to come across in this very New World manner, which is that New World fruit forward, rich, a little bit of almost like candy-like quality. Then on the palate, if it's sour, is like, okay, this might be an old world wine, which we're about to get there. So before we get to tasting, what would be some fruit descriptors on this? Is this also red fruited? I'm finding it to be, but I'm finding it to be a very different red fruit than number one, which we had that more of a candied red fruit. This is more of a dried red fruit quality to me. It just, and I think it's that age kind of thing. It feels like it's, fruit, dried cranberry, or dried, even like dried apple rings. So I do like that. There's that apple skin character I often get in red wine. You might think of apple as being more of a white wine descriptor, but I often get that red apple skin quality in red wine. Misty's saying dried red fruit. And then what about non-fruit? We've already talked about the coconut, but I mean, I also think that there are some spices going on here. And oh, by the way, see, I know this is very, it's a faux pas right now to touch your face, but y'all are all at your own homes. I'm here at the shop, just me and Colin. I can wash my hands afterwards. So this is a really good trick, so your nose gets fatigued very easily. And a way to reset it is to smell the back of your hand. You could smell your water glass, but really smell the back of your hand and then go back to the wine. And it kind of resets. Misty is saying she gets cinnamon. Yeah, I get that cinnamon quality. And then on the earth, we talked about it a little bit, but I do get some earth on this one. To me, this one's more about dry earth versus number one being about that dark, rich, garden soil. This is more of like a dry, dusty road to me, or dry leaves. It just has kind of this like autumn smell, like that, how we like to imagine like Norman Rockwell autumn smell, like raking the leaves and then drinking mulled cider. That's kind of what I'm getting right now. I also, we've already talked about it, but the last thing here is going to be oak. And, I think a lot of what we've discussed is leading us to, this is a wine that sees oak. That's what we're getting, if you've wondered. And, I think that there was the one person that said, I think it smells good. I think a lot of people do. They want an oak influence on their wine. And you might not know that about yourself. So that's one of those things that can be helpful when you're going to a shop or restaurant, is being able to say, I do like some oak influence. So now we're about to get into the really fun part, which is tasting. And it's okay if you've already tasted. Like I said, I'll never know. And we're going to see on our sheet, the things that are listed are sweetness, tannin, acid, body, and then getting into the whole fruit, non-fruit thing again. But let's talk about the first little bit. So sweetness. This is something that I like to talk about because the whole sweet versus dry. Well, a lot of times on the consumer side, people love to say they love a really dry red wine, meaning they love a red wine that really dries their mouth out. In wine nerd industry talk, when we talk about sweet versus dry, we are saying sweet has residual sugar. Dry does not have any residual sugar. So if we are doing a test running through that grid, the first thing we say after taking a sip is the wine is dry. Or if it's like a, some off dry German Riesling, we're like, the wine is slightly off dry. But with red wines, I mean, in a testing environment, it would be very doubtful they would ever be off dry. But I just like to let you know on that whole, it's just a total nerdy vocabulary term, sweet versus dry. Now, talking about the next two things, tannin and acid. So tannin is actually going to be the thing that dries your mouth out. And so that when you're saying that, oh, I love a really dry red wine, you're actually saying, oh, I love a really tannic red wine. So tannins are, they're actually, physical, chemical compounds that are found in the grape skin, stems, and seeds. And they latch onto the protein in your saliva and dry your mouth out and make your mouth feel like it has cotton balls in it, make your teeth feel like they have sweaters on them. I mean, we all know that feeling. And we're going to get to it in just a second. So, the tasting portion of this, there are these very scientific things. If you felt intimidated during the smelling part where we were just having to describe these, abstract things that we're each coming up with, during the tasting portion, I mean, there are very scientific things. There's the tannin. So we're going to see how much does it dry our mouth out. And that's going to lead us back to thinking about the grape's thickness or thinness. So a thicker skinned grape will have more tannin. So it's really drying our mouth out. It's a good chance it's a thicker skinned grape. Oak also has tannin. So if it has tannin, there's a chance it could be coming from oak, especially if there's not that much concentration of color. With the next thing that's going to be super sciencey is this acidity in the wine. So acid in the wine, I think it's one of the most important qualities in a wine. It cuts through the richness of food. Our body reacts to the acid in your mouth by making your mouth water. So you can tell how high is the acidity by how much is your mouth watering. Because your body's just thinking, there's an acidic solution. I need to neutralize it. So we talk a lot about saliva here. So how much is your mouth watering? It's pointing to how much acidity is in the wine. Now, the reason that we care about this from a wine nerd standpoint is this is going to help us. This whole thing is just we're building up these clues. It's like, we're a detective. And we are building up clues as to what is this grape? Where is it from? Well, acidity is very much related to climate. So we're going to need to know just a touch about grapes and on the vine, what they do. Well, they're a fruit, just like other fruits. They ripen, they develop sugars. And as they develop sugars, when they're ripening, the acidity level drops. In a warm climate, they have this really high metabolic activity where they make more and more sugar, and the acidity drops. So a warmer climate could lead to less acid. The other thing that's also going to go along with that in a warmer climate, so as we were saying, warmer climate, they produce more and more sugar. Well, the basics of fermentation is taking that sugar and turning it into alcohol. So warmer climate will have more sugar being turned into alcohol, more alcohol. So just think about, especially I brought up earlier, if you love like Napa Cab, it is a warm climate there. It is actually cool at night, so it preserves some of that acidity. At night, the grapes slow down that metabolic activity, and they literally chill out. But it is a pretty warm climate, so it's going to lead to having a pretty nice alcohol level. Versus what I said earlier, most of the old world is a cooler climate. So even places that have Cabernet Sauvignon, like Napa does, like Bordeaux, which we discussed earlier, is going to have lower alcohol levels. It's just not as warm. There's not as much sunlight to produce all that sugar that gets turned into alcohol. So sorry, that was a lot of science at once. So let's balance out the science by tasting, and we can apply it here to these wines. So wine number one. It's a dry wine. There's no residual sugar. I'm having my first impression of it, which I'm thinking about tannin and I'm thinking about acidity. And tannin, remember, is when it dries your mouth out, feels like there's cotton balls in your mouth. All red grapes are going to have, all red wines are going to have some tannin because they do spend time on the skin. So there's a little bit of tannin here, but, nothing crazy. It's not making me think I have to have a steak with this wine. I could be perfectly happy drinking this wine on the porch. Now, acidity, my mouth immediately started flooding with water. How's everybody? I haven't seen any comments in a while. What are y'all thinking? Are y'all getting that acidity, that flooding your mouth with saliva? Misty, thank you. Acid is medium plus, tannin is moderate. Yeah. I'm going to wait and see if there's some other comments. While I am waiting for other comments, I have Brianna Bishop, delicious. It is delicious. This is the kind of wine I need right now. This is feel good, happy wine, I like to call it. Kelly, low tannin, higher acid. Yep. One of the other things on your sheet underneath, I have sweetness, tannin, acid. Then it says body, which body is related to alcohol and tannin. And alcohol, real quick, we talked about it earlier related to the tears. And I love that, Elizabeth. Lots of saliva. Yes. Alcohol, the easiest way to judge it is is it burning your throat, like taking a shot of whiskey? I'm definitely not getting that from this wine. It's definitely, I'd say even low alcohol. But body, like I was saying, is related to the tannin and the alcohol. Body, if you want to think of a great analogy, is thinking about that skim milk would be light-bodied, whole milk would be medium-bodied, and then heavy cream would be full-bodied. So I'd say that this wine it's pretty, almost, I'd say, light-bodied. It's not that I think it's thin. It's yummy, but it's, yes, it's definitely, it's somewhere between light and medium body, but which would be a bad answer during a test. But that really is where I think it falls. Yeah, Misty, skim milk. Now, getting back to thinking about our fruit versus earth, there's definitely a lot of fruit. There is fruit on the palate here, but were you surprised that maybe it wasn't quite as this candied confectionery thing as the nose suggested? And yeah, Elizabeth, porch worthy. I agree. But on the nose, it just smells so candy-like. And then the palate, still some candy, but it has a tangy finish to me. This one is a little bit tricky. There was a lot of people that there's a good portion of y'all did the tasting last week, and so I kind of thought this wine would be a fun one to put in as a contrast to our wine number one last week, which we'll get to that at the end, talking about the contrast. Misty, very soft on the palate, delicate. Brianna, it smelled sweeter than it tastes. Yeah, that's really my point. Smelled sweeter than it tastes. Perfect. And then, we talk about late complexity. I think, you can get really technical about this. And even there's another testing organization, that they actually count off, how long am I getting, the flavor lasting, which actually is still there for me. I think that it has a medium long finish, but it's complexity. It's not overly complex. It's we said it's a nice porch wine. Let's move on. The best way to really learn is this contrast between the two. I would even you can pour yourself a little bit more, like even go back and forth when we get to the end of this and really see the difference between these two. So wine number 2, which we got really the overriding thing we spent a lot of time talking about were the oak characteristics in this wine. And then it had this more dried earth, dried fruit quality. So it's going to be very interesting to see how it does on the palate. I want you to once again think about tannin, think about acidity. I'm contemplating. How would y'all say this compares in terms of tannin and acidity to wine number 1? Yeah, lower acid for sure. It makes you realize number 1 really did have some high acid. So what does that in Courtney? More tannin. Yeah. So let's talk about, so that this one has lower acid. Number 1 has higher acid. So here's a little review. What does that mean? The number 1, higher acid. What does that mean in terms of where it could come from, in terms of the climate? Who can answer that? Be a total wine nerd and answer. Number 1, having that higher acid. What does it tell us about the climate the grape grew in? Would it be a cooler climate or a warmer climate? I'll wait for y'all to answer. Misty did say higher. Oh, look, Misty's on it. Higher acid is a cooler climate. So number 1, cooler climate. Number 2, probably a warmer climate. Also, though, we talked about, we've talked about on the color of this, on the smell of it. Also, we kind of are going to this having oak on it and also possibly some age. Now, we didn't really talk about with age what happens with a wine. So even though I said stereotypically that Old World is going to be more earthy and New World more fruity, which is true-ish, but all wine is made from fruit. So at the beginning, I mean, New World and Old World will all have a little bit more fruit at the front, but then as they age, that fruit diminishes and it sees earthy characteristics, even in New World wine, that come forward. And this is something I think that either you like or don't love. I mean, it's a lot of people want to drink wine that's all about, the fresh, youthful quality. There's something, that's really magical when a wine ages. Not all wines are meant for aging, but they do go towards this more earthy spot. And with this wine number 2, I'm definitely getting that more earthy aged characteristic to it. And also, sorry, getting back to my point, with age, the acidity diminishes. So I think all signs are pointing towards number 2 having some age on it. So what are you getting out of number 2? Is it, for y'all, are you finding it to be more fruit or more earth? Those of y'all that have experience thinking about Old World versus New World, is this seeming one way or the other? And, I didn't ask this, but I think it's always interesting to know if you already associate yourself with being more of a New World or Old World drinker. I definitely have my days for both. Misty, lower acid is a warmer climate. Misty says more earth on this on number 2. Also on number 2, are you getting, what about the alcohol? Misty says Old World on number 2. I'm getting maybe a touch more alcohol on number 2. So here's the other total, nerdy. Kelly says earth. Part of our review. So touch more alcohol on number 2. what does that mean in terms of climate? Alcohol, more alcohol would mean a cooler climate or a warmer climate. Yeah, Misty's saying alcohol is moderate plus. It's not high. I mean, high alcohol wines are going to almost, I mean, you can almost get the alcohol in the nose. Misty, more alcohol means warmer climate. Yeah, Misty is studying for her SOM test. So, you know, she is the ringer here, but that's good too. It makes it easier on me. Yeah. So you can see how much we've learned about these wines. I mean, I think if you've never done this before, you're like, how can we actually, you know, get to any sort of conclusion? You know, there's so many wines out there, so many wines in the world. How can we get to a conclusion? But let's review what we've learned about these wines. Okay, wine number one, it's a relatively light concentration of color in the glass. It was very purple, pointing towards it being, you know, youthful. And then we had this very, you know, candy red fruit nose. And then no real apparent oak on it. Then on the palate, that candied fruit went to a more not as candied quality, a little bit more earth on the palate. And it had this great acidity, pointing towards a cooler climate. Then we didn't really have that much tannin, not surprisingly, because it didn't have that much concentration of color. So we're thinking, you know, that this is a thin-skinned grape from a cooler climate that's not seeing a lot of oak, if any oak at all. So look, we've learned, think about this. We've learned so much about this wine number one. I mean, I think we're kind of ready to start thinking about some conclusions. I don't like to keep y'all here all night. So that was my summation of wine number one. Anybody want to add their 2 cents on wine number one? And if you'll remember, I said the two most famous thin-skinned grapes that would have, you know, this lower tannin and that lower concentration of color would be Pinot Noir and Gamay. So I know everyone's heard of Pinot. I mean, I think probably a lot of people really love Pinot, like me. It's definitely my comfort red wine. But Gamay, you might not have heard of. Gamay is it's another native grape of the same region in France as Pinot, which is Burgundy. But Gamay is from a subregion known as the Beaujolais, which you might have negative associations with the Beaujolais. But from Beaujolais Nouveau that comes out around Thanksgiving each year. But in fact, Beaujolais can make some really great wines. Beaujolais Nouveau is something that's released literally right after a harvest. And not all Beaujolais is like that. And there's some good Beaujolais Nouveau, but a lot of the stuff that you see that's case stacked at the grocery store is not great. So I've got, you know, Misty saying Old World on number one, and she thinks it is a Gamay. Any other thoughts on that? I might just leave it there for a second and let people chime in if they'd like. But we can let's review number two. Let's talk about, like I said, we're just building up. I love reading murder mysteries, and it's just like that. We're just building up these clues. Kelly agrees with Misty. Yay. All right, we'll see. We're about to get there. All right, so number two, we saw that it looked very different in the glass. It had, but you know, it still had a relatively light concentration of color, but it has this orangish brownish hue. And I would have Elizabeth saying Weston thinks it's Gamay. I'm more of a novice. Don't undersell yourself, Elizabeth. But number two, we had the orangish brownish color pointing towards it having some age or, you know, at least time in barrel. And then when we got to the nose of it, we immediately were like, okay, there is some oak influence on this wine. We were getting coconut, which coconut really, I didn't get into this, but I didn't want to just give it away. Coconut is very much associated with American oak. So that is going to lead us to classic regions that would use American oak. Then on the fruit quality, we had it having this dried fruit quality. Also more, you know, so something you'd find in a wine with a little bit of age on it. And then we had that dried earth quality. And just some of those what we call tertiary qualities that are associated with age. On the palate, we also found this. We had less acidity, which the acidity would drop with some age. We also had a little bit, of tannin. It was not, if anyone that was here last week, wine number 2 last week had a lot more tannin. This did have some tannin, the kind of tannin we would associate with oak. And we found that it had some even more of that oaky quality on the palate, and just this earthiness to it. So let's see. I've got lots of comments coming in. Misty Wilder, number 2, American Oak. Kelly, my husband thinks Napa Cab. Misty thinks Rioja or Cali Cab. Okay. Yeah, let's talk about this. The major reason that this would not be, I think that, it seems in this situation like it is richer than number 1. So it's like, maybe it is Cab. But I guarantee if you happen to have some Cab in your house, go pour a little bit. It's going to have this really deep concentration of color from it being that thick-skinned grape. Remember, this one, we could read through it. It did not have this high concentration of color. It also didn't have, while it has tannins, it's not, Cab tannins are the kind that just make you, like I said earlier, feel like, oh my gosh, I need something rich to go with this, like some sort of protein. Misty's like, not Cab. The color's not there. Yeah. When we talked way earlier about the tears, with a Napa Cab, you would actually, the tears would even be stained on the glass. Also, the alcohol on this. We said it has a little more alcohol, but Napa Cab, you stick your nose in a glass of Napa Cab, most of the time it's almost going to be a little singy. You're going to even get that alcohol on the nose. Grenache, I like that guess. That's a really good guess, actually, is Grenache. And it brings us to a fun point of talking about Grenache is a little bit of a tricky grape. I hardly even use it in blind tasting because I don't like to make things too difficult. I would use it in industry blind tasting. So Grenache is a native grape of the it kind of is shared between whether it's native grape of Spain or of southern France. But when I think of a Grenache that might taste like this, I would think of southern France, the southern Rhone to be specific, and like Chateauneuf du Pape. There you find it blended with other grapes. So Grenache, it does actually have, it loses its color. It's a thin-skinned grape. It would have a color like this, and it does have this very kind of candy, yummy red fruit quality, which this wine has a little bit of that, But the one thing that's missing as far as thinking about this being Grenache, unless it was, say, Australian Grenache, which that would be like an advanced wine tasting to throw an Australian Grenache in, is the fact that there's all this coconut on here, that just coconut dill, which sounds weird. It took me a long time to ever get it, but it's this dill characteristic. It comes from American oak, and especially American oak on Tempranillo. Like once you get this wine down, you'll never get it wrong again. And so we're going to reveal it. It's not Grenache, but I'm going to have the fun part of actually showing you the bottles. So I think, any other guesses as to what it is? We had Misty saying it was Rioja or California Cab, and then saying she didn't think it was Cab. So I'm guessing she says it's Rioja. And then I think that we had also had somebody else saying Cab, which I kind of was talking y'all away from that and why it wouldn't be Cab. Feel free to throw in some other guesses. We're going to start revealing number 1. Oh, and also, I think, sorry, I was going to say the alcohol. We talked about, the alcohol would be so much higher on this for Cab, but also for Grenache. Grenache usually takes a really long time to ripen on the vine, and it's a lot more alcohol. Number 1, are we ready? It's the fun part. Woo! Y'all can see that. So turn it over. Let's see where it actually says. On the back, I never know, I think it might be a mirror image, but you can probably read it. It says Beaujolais Cru. This is Cru Beaujolais. So when we use the term cru in Beaujolais, it just means that it's from you hear cru used a lot in France to mean different things. In other parts of Burgundy, you hear Grand Cru, meaning the highest level. Cru in Beaujolais is synonymous with village or commune, and there are these 10 crus of Beaujolais that are villages, communes. Fleury is one of them. And this is where you have that higher quality going on versus the Beaujolais Nouveau that we talked about earlier. Beaujolais Nouveau is not made from these villages, but rather further south. All right, Jessica is saying, Rita way to go, Rita. I love that. Rita is like a longtime customer here. But I've never gotten a blind taste with her in person. I've now done it twice on YouTube. Way to go. I know Rita's got a good palate. She likes the good stuff. So this is Cru Beaujolais. Like I was saying, the Beaujolais Nouveau is from the southern part of Beaujolais where it's sandier and just doesn't make as great a wine. Up here in the Crus, we have this granite soil type that is perfect for making a more complex wine. So this is Gamay. Gamay is the star red grape, the only red grape of the Beaujolais. You also can find white Beaujolais made from Chardonnay. You don't really talk about that nearly as much. I mean, it really is all about Gamay in the Beaujolais. And I always joke around with my boyfriend. He, has learned a little bit vicariously. Not a little bit. He's learned a good bit vicariously through me. And I always it kind of rhymes, like Gamay from the Beaujolais. So star grape of the Beaujolais is Gamay. And yeah, if you like Pinot, I mean, you can probably also like Gamay. Who already drinks Gamay? And who already drinks Cru Beaujolais? I love to hear that. I'm hoping some of y'all do. If you don't, I mean, it's a great thing to learn about. And this bottle, some Cru Beaujolais gets expensive. It used to be all just totally, I mean, it was just underpriced. I mean, you get so many great deals. A lot of it now is getting pricier, but there's still some deals we had. This is a $19 bottle. Yeah, Natalie said Gamay is my favorite. Awesome. I actually you do find Gamay in other places. We'll find some New World Gamay. We'll also find some Gamay in the Northern Rhone, so Beaujolais is actually very close to the Northern Rhone. Elizabeth, I put a Gamay from the Northern Rhone in y'all's bag that I sent y'all this afternoon. So you'll have to try that and see how it compares to this. Yeah, I love it. Look at everybody's like, cool. I'm glad. So Elizabeth just said Weston loves a Gamay. Well, guess what? You've got one in your bag. That, and if anyone else wants to try a Gamay from the Northern Rhone to contrast, I have a great one here that's also 20. Okay, so moving on to wine number 2. And by the way, so the reason I thought this would be a fun contrast, wine number 1 this week with wine number 1 last week. Last week we had an Oregon Pinot, and I mean, honestly, it can be tricky. I mean, I've messed it up many times myself, thinking that a Beaujolais is like an Oregon Pinot. But it's all about realizing that it does just have a little bit more of that sour finish and a little bit more acidity than an Oregon Pinot would. But it's tricky because in Beaujolais, I don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole, and we're already like kind of over the hour I said we would have. But there's a winemaking technique in the Beaujolais that brings out that candied quality in the wine, and that's what makes it so tricky. But so I thought those of y'all that did it both weeks, that contrast between a New World Pinot and an Old World Gamay. Okay, so wine number 2. I think we have Misty weighing in that it's Rioja. Everyone else kind of out there on the fence. So it is indeed, it is a Rioja Reserva. and it's from a really classic producer, La Rioja Alta, and it's 2015. So they do have pretty strict aging requirements in Rioja. This is the current release for Rioja Alta's Reserva. So it's nice if you like wine with a little bit of age. You can find some Rioja Reservas that don't cost a fortune. I mean, this is always been the best deal, always will be probably. I mean, most of them get a little more expensive than this, but this is $22. But I just love it because it's classic. I mean, they use American oak on this. It is also 100% Tempranillo. And Misty said, this one's so good too. Yeah, it's a total classic. It does actually have, I'm surprised, the alcohol on this is higher than, I didn't look at the alcohol before we tasted it. It's 14.5%. I mean, it doesn't always that's really high for Rioja. It's like Napa high. But the age has mellowed it out. Also, I did want to look at the alcohol by contrast, the alcohol on the Beaujolais, 12.5%. So Rioja, though, is a region, it's up there in northern central Spain. And it is, you can have Tempranillo, you can have Grenache, some lesser known grapes, but it's really mostly about, especially the really good ones, a lot of times will be 100% Tempranillo, like this one. And Tempranillo, you can extract some color out of it. You'll see that happen more so in other regions like Ribera del Duero. But usually in Rioja, unless they're doing some crazy modern technique, you don't see that kind of extraction. And this is more of that classic technique with La Rioja Alta versus going like crazy modern extracted. Because you will see some people using small new French oak barrels in Rioja. This is what I was saying. This is more of that classic using old, American oak barrels. They make their own barrels there, and focusing on the Tempranillo grape. So who liked this one? I'd always like to say at the end of this, the most important question is, which was your favorite? So why don't you weigh in and tell me which was your favorite? So does coconut smell a big clue for Rio? Oh, yeah. When you smell, especially, I think there's just that certain smell it's like the coconut it's like the aged American oak with Tempranillo is just this classic Rioja smell. I think the one thing that's tricky is that when I first got into studying wine and, was in a tasting group and an industry tasting group, but the reality is, I mean, none of us, have a fortune to spend on bringing a bunch of like old Bordeaux or something to this tasting group. So anytime somebody would bring something with age, as most of the time it would be a Rioja. So you start to just associate thinking that some of this age characteristics is always Rioja. So some of what the smell that we have going on here is an aged red wine smell, but then the rest of it is this total aged red wine influenced by American oak, and that is Rioja. Brianna, number one, was definitely my favorite. Misty, the Gamay is eye-opening. I never appreciated before. Great. Kelly, I like both. Very different, yeah. Rita and Brent like the Gamay most. I'm a Rioja lover. And I think, so much of this depends on, like we said, number one, perfect porch sipper. It would also be great with pizza. A lot of takeout going on these days. But, this one, the Pinot Alberti, it could even stand up to a steak, or just something on the grill. Sausages. Elizabeth said, we like both, but love the Rioja smell so much. And yeah, and if you like that smell, it's oak, like I was saying, it's just like knowing, that you might like some oak on your wine. But I like it that I think it seems like most people here, are liking, different wines for different occasions. And it's not like they hated one and loved the other. So that makes me very happy as a wine lover and wine advocate myself. Does anyone have any further questions? I'm really excited too that we didn't have any buffering issues. I don't think my nerves could not take in the buffering issues this time. So I'm very glad there was no buffering issues. And I'm also just excited. So last week we did, like I said, we did Oregon Pinot versus a Chianti, so Sangiovese from the Chianti region of Italy. So really covering these classic regions and classic red grapes. And this is the way that we learn. I'm totally open for more questions, but I've already drug it out a little bit. Hopefully y'all are getting ready to have something delicious to eat. And yeah, really, it's been fun to do these, even though it's even more fun in person. I'm glad to not lose sight of doing them. We next week, little sneak preview. Y'all will be the first to know about this. Is that next week we won't be doing the blind tasting on Thursday because I have something like extra special lined up where we are going to have a tasting with a really renowned California winemaker. And yeah, so I will send out the email about it. I think that one we might do over Zoom and because he feels more comfortable. I like doing these over YouTube and they're saved for people to watch later. But I think this one we might do over Zoom, and I have a variety of used wines at all price points. So, having something to taste along with. But I mean, even Colin and I are like really excited about this. It's that extra special thing. But thank you. And yeah, I love just having some interaction, even if it's just through y'all typing. And I just hope everybody's staying safe and sane. Like I said, I know this is trying on everyone's nerves. And we just can't thank y'all enough, and just look forward to having y'all back in the shop. I mean, I feel like we're like hopefully halfway through. And so, yeah, we can make it, y'all. We appreciate it. Colin says hi. There's Colin. All right. Thank you all very much. Stay safe. Bye, y'all.